to the fact that these are of eternal consequences that we've been emphasizing, but also part of it is that this is the message, this is the lifestyle that Jesus lived and that he is imitating, and it's going to be connected to the love that God has for us, and it's also going to be connected to the resurrection, the hope that is before us. And so we're going to see some of that, but what we had here in chapter 3 is this big section about the contrast of ministries. We had the ministry there of Moses versus the ministry of Paul, and how now, instead of seeing God's glory with a veil or hiding part of that, we now have it on full display in the person and in the face of Jesus Christ. That's what we ended with there at the end of verse 6. So what we have been describing, though, is, remember in Corinthians, they have this problem basically where they're just trying to mold and shape part of the gospel into what they want it to be. So maybe emphasize certain aspects, but kind of diminish other aspects. And so Paul's giving this balanced perspective of everything that is entailed in the message of the cross. Now, what we ended with is this enormous blessing, this enormous treasure that we have that is the glory of God. It's been revealed. It's shined into our hearts, is what he says there in verse 5. And it's to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But now he's going to go back to who he is and his perceived weakness and the way that he's living his life. And the reason that he's doing that in part is so that people understand he's an authentic apostle. He's authentically living and teaching the gospel. And we're going to talk about some of that as we go forward. So let's go ahead and read this whole section here together. If somebody would, go ahead and read here verse 7 down through verse 18. And we'll go through and we'll break it up in a couple of sections. But let's get the whole thought here.
But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For we who live are always delivered to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So then death is working in us, but life in you. And since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, I believed and therefore I spoke. We also believe and therefore speak, knowing that he who raised up the Lord Jesus will also raise us up with you, and will present us with you. For all things are for your sake, that grace, having spread through the many, may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God.
Verse 18, just through the end of the chapter.
Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal.
Okay, great. So a lot of this, does this seem a little bit more familiar? At least the end of this is a more familiar section to us. But what we have here is in verses 7 down through 11, we have description of the lifestyle and the purpose of his ministry, the way that he lives and why he's doing that. Then in verses 13 through 15, we have a picture of the ultimate goal. Okay? So he's got present life, then future goal. And then in verses 16 through 18, he lives in this, and we've been talking about this at other points, but it's in this now but not yet. He's being transformed on the inside. He has a treasure inside him. There's so many wonderful things, and yet what's happening to his outward body? Yeah, it's decaying. It's just falling apart, okay? And so there's this tension that is important, and it's going to be important for the Corinthians to understand And it's also important for us because the Corinthians might have thought, oh, Jesus has come, we have everything that we need right now, we have the victory. They might have oversold the idea, and yet Paul has these two kind of tied together to explain the present condition as well as the future hope. So let's walk through this first section here, verses 7 down through, let's start with 7 down through 15. And we'll kind of walk through this, but let's do this same pattern that we usually do here. So what are things that jump out to you? What are things that are interesting to you as you look at this particular section?
Treasure.
Yeah, treasure. Yeah, very good. Very good. Okay, affliction. So that goes back to, remember, when we talked about the first chapter, there were our three major themes. One of them was affliction and comfort. The other one was life through death, and then there was another one, but I can't even remember it. So if I can't remember, you probably can't either. So, but these are like a couple of those coming back to where we were talking about.
Of God and not of us.
Okay. Yeah, so of God and then not of us. So you're talking about the power, particularly in verse 7. Yeah. And remember, that's been one of the other major themes that we've been trying to emphasize is God's power in weakness. And that is ultimately seen in Jesus. That's the paradox. And yet that's the idea, though, that Paul was trying to get across for how he lives and also how the Corinthians think of things. Do you have one also? Okay. Who else had one?
Juxtaposition between death and life.
Yeah, death and life. That's going to be big as we go forward. Go ahead, Pete.
Well, along with what Ed said about treasures, it seemed a little strange to me put treasures in jars of clay.
Oh, yeah. One thing that is interesting about that is we think of jars of clay, and it's kind of a strange deal. I guess in a sense, it is kind of strange to put the treasure in that. But I think part of that is referring to the original creation. What is man made out of? Yeah, it's just dirt, right? And that's all we are. And I like the version that Jeremy had. What version were you reading from, Jeremy? Yeah, it had earthen vessels. And it just kind of gets that same concept so that we can understand in this entire section, he's talking about the body and what he's enduring and how the body is to be used. Because remember, in 1 Corinthians, we laid this out, but and we'll see it here, is that in 1 Corinthians 6, he says that our body has been redeemed. It's been bought with a price. And so we're supposed to glorify God in our bodies. And he talked about in that context about sexual morality. But you'll notice he's doing the same thing here, like in verse 10 and also there in verse 11. He has that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. And then he has this introduction, or there's a line in between it. And then he says, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. He says almost the exact same thing, but it's the same concept about how do we operate in the body presently while we're waiting for the new body that's going to come. Okay? So what else? What other things jump out to you?
The repeat of the phrase, we do not lose heart.
Yeah, so that was one thing that whenever I was going through and marking this text, it might have been last week, but that was one of the things I just kind of walked through the flow of thought, and he repeats that over and over and over again, which makes you think that's what they're kind of having the question about. Why do you live this way? You look like you're losing. You look like you're being defeated, and yet you don't give up. You just keep on going. And so there's a lot to be said there. What else?
The concept of resurrection, that verse 14 and 15. Not only Jesus, not only Paul, but also the things.
Right. that's one of the first things that he talked about. The lesson that he learned through the trial there in Ephesus was for this purpose, not to trust in himself, but to trust in God who raises us from the dead. And so he's taking that same theme and putting it right here. Very good. What else? Yes, I'm sorry. You're like right behind the pole. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and one thing that's interesting about this is, and we're kind of emphasizing as we go through it, is that this is one of the most dense and longest sections about evangelism in the Bible. But a lot of times we don't even, like, we just kind of miss it. And yet that's what he's describing here about this is how we get the knowledge of God out. This is how we get the knowledge of Christ out. This is how the entire nations learn about it. This is how more people increase in thanksgiving to the glory of God. Like, it's through this means, it's through this mechanism that this comes about. Okay, and I want to mention this. Are there any Old Testament quotations here? Okay, Psalm 116. So we're going to have to go back and look at that one because he just kind of makes this statement, and we're kind of like, what? what's he talking about? And yet it's an important point for what he has. Okay, so I've given some of the interpretation concepts here, but there was a couple of things that I think are interesting here. In verse 8, he goes through these contrasts, right? And I mentioned that one of the reasons that Corinthians is really interesting, but it can also be something, in a sense, a little more difficult, is Paul goes through a series of paradoxes. And you see it here, crushed. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. And so he gives these same kind of comparisons here. And so what do you think is the point of the comparison there? Like, why did he move to this thought coming from verse 7 and what we just saw? Like back in verses 1 through 6 as well.
Well, they could see the bad part of the equation. They could see that he was perplexed and afflicted and persecuted and all those things. But they probably didn't have the same sense of the other side of the victory that he was having, even in spite of those things.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things that what we'll notice is sometimes what makes 2 Corinthians hard is because he's got a flow of thought, and it seems like he kind of takes a left turn because he's talking about this glory and the light and everything, and then he's like, okay, but we're not giving up. And we're being destroyed. So what you're describing is right, but what do you think is? Why do you think he's coming back to that? I mean, and I guess you pretty much explained it, but they're seeing part of it, but they're not seeing the victory behind that. And why then are they not seeing that? Why are they missing this victory concept that is there in verses 8 and 9?
Well, it's talking about, this light shining out of darkness and this glory on glory that surpasses the old glory. But what they see is this affliction, persecution, getting crushed, and it's easy to think that must not be the way if it's met by that. If the jar of clay gets broken,
Right.
and you're the jar of clay there, it's hard to see that as glorious. But ultimately, it's there just to serve that purpose. That I just kind of see the jars of clay in 7 connecting with the body, always carrying around in the body. That the death of Jesus. That's how we're carrying the glory is within our broken self. So it can make sense why being crushed and all these things is glorious.
Sure. And if you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, they're no different than we are. We have a problem sometimes seeing the long picture,
Oh, sure.
the long story. We're concerned about what's going on here. We can tell ourselves mentally that the next life is what matters, but then we can't help but get wrapped up in what we see and what's going on with us now, and how difficult life can be sometimes, or how things are not going our way, or we don't understand how God's working, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And he's just trying to emphasize, it seems to me, that don't do that. Don't worry so much about the things here in this life, but look to the long game.
Right. And one of the things that is interesting, notice he's talking about the body, and another way that Paul uses that is he talks about the flesh in the sense of the corruptible, tangible body that's falling apart that we experience right now. And if you remember, back in chapter 2, he says that the natural man or the earthly man cannot receive the things of the Spirit of God for their foolishness to him. And so he also said in chapter 3 that you are still fleshly, and there's a result. You have jealousy, envy, strife, all of those kind of things as a result of it. And so what you have is people that are getting just tied up in what they can see presently. It's the flesh, what they feel, what they see, what they touch, the world as they experience it right now. And yet what he will talk about later in chapter 5 and verse 16, he says, talking about Christ, he says just in generally, therefore from now on we recognize no one according to the flesh. Now he's not saying like you recognize, like you understand somebody, but it's like we're not acknowledging, we're not concerned about the flesh anymore. Even though we have known Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him in this way no longer. It's not just about the container, in a sense, that a person has or their body, even though that's going to be important, and we'll talk about that more. A lot of times that's all we see, is we just see the physical body that a person has, and we're not understanding something deeper is at play. And so whenever the body then is getting beat up, and it's not going well, if that's all we're thinking about, then we're just like, oh, why would you endure that? Why would you go through that? Okay? And I think that's part of what he's describing, because he says, we're carrying the body, in the body, the death of Jesus. So when you look at all of these concepts, in 10, 11, and 12, he uses things like carrying in the body the death of Jesus, that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our bodies. He mentions that a couple of times. It's almost like you have this progression, or like it's an inclusio, or kind of it's like repetitions that build to his main point. Because verse 10 is almost the same thing as verse 12. And then the rest of verse 10 about Jesus' life being manifested is basically the same thing at the end of verse 11. But look at this line right here in the middle of this. He says, for we who live are always being given to death for Jesus' sake. Okay? Now, that's the point that he's trying to get at here in this section. But how was he actually giving his life? And why was he doing this? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so that they can live. And I know it seems kind of bizarre on the surface, but there's a couple of things that are very important. I mean, I look out and, we have a lot of parents, okay? Would you die for your child? Just pretty much everybody would. But not only that, are there plenty of times as a parent that you're actually kind of living a life of death? To where if it was about you and the way that you lived your life, you'd say, why am I enduring this? Why am I going through this? And it's simple things like waking up during the night, or any number of things that, of course, maybe some of us guys who don't actually wake up during the night. I don't know why I take care of that. But the whole concept is, there are many things that if you just looked at it from a pure equation concept, and it was just about you, you wouldn't do that. But why do you, in a sense, die for others? Yeah. Well, it's trying to teach you something, right? So there's something to be said there. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. And remember, that's one thing that he's going to emphasize. You're my beloved children, and I love you, and that's the reason I'm doing this. And many of the things that he goes through and describes are in that way. And in fact, just go a little bit farther. A lot of y'all have dealt with teenagers. And the kind of things that you go through with teenagers is different. And a lot of it feels like you're dying because you're like, okay, you're going this direction. I'm having to worry about you the entire time, try to make sure you're provided for, try to deal with disputes or all kinds of things. Why do you live like that if you could just say, I don't care, cut you off, I'm going to live the way I want to live? And that's the contrast here that he's describing. He's not saying just jump into suffering for suffering's sake. Notice what he says. He says at the end, or in verse 11, for we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake. And that's one thing we highlighted in the series on 1 Corinthians, and I want to highlight again here. When he uses for Jesus' sake, or when he says for the gospel's sake, remember, this is Mark 8. This is Matthew chapter 16. Anyone who gives up these things for my sake and the gospel's sake, it will be given back. You've got this great reward ahead of you. And so, again, it's explaining the gospel, but it's also putting it in terms of the family relationship, the love that you have, and trying to get that concept across. So let's look here also down here at verses 13 down through 15. What is the spirit of faith that he's talking about there?
Maybe referring to he just kind of compared what he's going through, saying he's no more than Jesus did. And he said we have the same spirit, which leads into this quote from Psalm 116. Psalm 116 is about a man who basically hard-pressed, perplexed,
Yeah.
all those things that he just described. And the man in Psalm 116 puts a total trust in the Lord to get him through that.
Right.
And so he has the same spirit of faith as the one in Psalm 116. He put his trust in the Lord. That's where it is. The Lord's going to deliver me. And even if I die, he says, we'll be raised from the dead.
Yeah, so the interesting thing, let's talk a little bit about 116. And let me just connect the Spirit. So remember, the Spirit is the one that is revealing the beauty and the wisdom and power of Jesus. And so when I truly understand the work of the Spirit and I accept that, like I understand the concept, I then live by faith. And he goes to 116 as an example of this. Now what's interesting is this is a psalm, and it is about a righteous man being delivered. And Paul obviously applies it to himself, but what might not be obvious is that this is a messianic psalm as well. This is one of the ones that talks about the Jewish hope of being rescued from death and about being resurrected. That is the means by which God is going to save his people. And so you look at some of these same concepts. He's going down to the cords of death have encompassed me, verse 3. The terrors of Sheol have come upon me. And he's saying, save my life. And so, yes, the soul does return to rest, but then you have in verse 9 this concept of walking before the Lord in the land of the living. And there's multiple concepts here. But this is actually a psalm likely that we know for verse 15, where he says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his godly ones. Now, I don't know how you've thought about that verse in the past, but that verse is not saying that God thinks your death is something that he's really glad you went through and experienced. That's not what that text is saying. He's saying the fact that a righteous person has been killed or has died through suffering is precious to him for two reasons. One, it's because this person has done this for his sake. And second off, it's also precious because the Lord is looking at that life and saying, I'm going to save that life. I'm going to give that life back to that person. Okay? And so that's when you have this concept, verses 16 down through the verse 18. He's been loosed from his bonds. He offers a sacrifice. He pays his vows. And then he's going to there be in the courts of the Lord's house in the midst of you, O Jerusalem. And so, obviously, he's not talking about the actual physical Jerusalem as much as he's talking about the Jerusalem that is above. But what he has, the verse he references is right here in verse 10, where it says, I believe when I said, I am greatly afflicted. And so you have the same concept, I believe, and so I spoke. That's the concept he's referring to. And what he's trying to get across, or what? Well, you tell me, what do you think why does he quote that text? Why does he reference that?
Both of those verses are, saying exactly the same thing he's been saying to these people. Your death is not the end. Your suffering here is not the end. There's a purpose for that. We may not be seeing it, but the Lord wants you to be home with Him. And if you're faithful here, even in bad circumstances, again, in the long run, you're going to be better.
Yeah, and by the way, just hold on to Psalm 116, because he doesn't just kind of, let me just grab one verse out of there. He's referencing the whole context, as we've been talking about, but it also becomes the foundation, to a certain extent, of what he's going to expect in the future, or through the rest of this text, here in chapter 4 and going on in chapter 5. But what does he mean that he spoke? So he's believing something, and then he says, and so I spoke as a result of that.
Perhaps a belief in the delivery, as mentioned in verse 8, for you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he does that in two ways. One, he's having to tell the Corinthians, hey, this is what you're actually expecting. Okay, this is how you're supposed to live. But also, isn't that the message that you share with the world? Because we're not the only ones that die. Everybody in the world dies. And in part, when we have believed what God will do for the righteous person to save them from their sins and from their death, that's the gospel. That's the means. That's the message. We're not just telling people, hey, live a better life. We're not just giving them moral rules or a law code or something like that, even though there is aspects of obedience to that. We're showing people the good news. You've been freed from sin and death. That's the gospel. And so once we can fully internalize and understand it, then we have the means by which we can share the word with other people. Okay? So look at what he says. He says, I believed and so I spoke. So we also believe and so we also speak. What do we know? Well, we know that he raised the Lord Jesus. That's Psalm 116. That's what it was about, in part. It's about what he was going to do with Jesus. But, Bill, you made this progression. Where does he go to next?
I don't know. Jesus, he'll raise me, he'll raise Grant.
Yeah. And remember, that's what we did when we talked about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. What is true of him will be true of us. That's the entire mechanism. And it just goes through. They're being faithful to it. It eventually will happen and pass on to you. And then look at verse 15. So it is all for your sake. This goes back to why he was living the way that he did. And then as a result, what happens? This goes back to what Paula was mentioning. What happens when we all decide to not live for ourselves, to die in the present, and then have our hope completely set on the resurrection? What happens? Yeah. The grace extends to more and more people. It increases in thanksgiving. They're thankful for what God has done, and then they're glorifying him as a result of that. Okay? So when we think about these concepts, there are tons of applications that I think come out of this then. So tell me, how do you think we use this text? What's the value that comes out of it?
I think it offers hope because, it's not, life isn't easy.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you try to concentrate on that rather than what's going on here, that's what keeps you going.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting that that's the exact same point that he makes in verse 16. So we do not lose heart. And that's the whole thing. We give up a lot of times because we haven't internalized the gospel rightly. And so that's a great application. We're going to see more of that. He just kind of repeats it over and over. But what else? Good. Oh, I'll come to you in just a second.
First.
Oh, ladies first. So.
No. I just think it's always important to remember that he's talking in essence to new converts, right? So they were converted, he left, they had to figure this out. And so tying it back to this is not really a new idea, right?
Right.
You're a new convert and there's this new religion in town and you're surrounded by things you've always known. You're surrounded by idols, you're surrounded by people who aren't living in a spiritual way. So when he's tying it back into scripture from the Old Testament, he's really just saying, this is the way it's always been.
Right.
It's just the fulfillment of it, that Christ is the fulfillment of it, and that when you can put yourself in that spirit, your life does not become magically easier when you accept Christ.
Right.
But there are joys and there's pieces in that once you have it, you're going to want to share that, and you're going to want to bring other people into that as well. So it's, it's part saying, stop paying attention to the persecution and pay attention to the important stuff,
Right.
which is really valuable for us to remember when we are encouraging and working to be grown converts. And it's important for us to remember when we're going through hard times, when life is hard, and you think, I am trying to do everything right, but this is not working out for me.
Yeah.
Right? There are got to be easier ways to do this. And, maybe I'm the only person in the room that has ever felt like, wow, this is hard.
Yeah.
But it very quickly turns around and you can move your focus back to God, back to Jesus.
Right.
So as soon as you move your focus back to Jesus, all of that other stuff goes away because the grace.
Yeah. Well, and there's a couple of things you mentioned there that are really, really helpful. One is just like suffering in general that it helps with. And what he's describing here is where you intentionally suffer for the benefit of other people. Okay? Like that's giving money to help other people. This is a person that has, there's maybe, some kind of family situation going on, and you're spending hours. You just feel like you're pouring yourself out, and you feel, in a sense, you're kind of like, I'm dying, trying to help you through this process, or like with your kids, or any number of things. And yet, what Paul is saying, we do that all the time with all these different people because this same hope. And one of the things, too, that was interesting that you mentioned is you talk about this has been, historically, but this is the way that we should see Jesus' life. Jesus lived this message. And it boils down such a profound message with all of the implications of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians in the entire New Testament, but it was all embodied in a single person in the way that he lived his life. And so then he's expecting us to go through and do that. But as you ended, that's the means. That's the means to get it out in the world, because you then have this, why are you living the way that you're living? You don't live like the rest of us. You're not constantly concerned about your comfort and your pleasures and all of that. There's any number of things that come out of that. Go ahead.
It's how do we live a life where we're constantly giving ourselves over to death? And if I'm looking at my life, it's far less like obvious persecutions and things like that, and it looks a lot more like me needing to give up the things that I would like to accomplish and experience in my life from a worldly perspective. Man, I want to be able to do this or meet this goal from a very physical perspective. And that part of my life, and be able to accomplish that before I die, and hanging on to that really tightly. But giving myself over to death is accomplished by this true belief and trust that I am absolutely, truly going to be given my life back to me,
Right.
And have a new life and a resurrected life for eternity.
Right.
And that's how we can be in a situation where we're choosing, okay, right or left here, my passion or this individual that has a need, my evening or my neighbor, and things like that. That I constantly choose the self one.
So my evening.
Yeah.
Well, and part of this too, that is important to see too. And trust me, I respect every person that is preacher or deacon or elder or anybody that serves in the local church. But the whole concept is this is church ministry. This is what it is. If you get into it and say everybody's going to follow me, everything is going to go great, we're just going to have a hunky-dory time, that wasn't Corinth. And further, it's not going to be like that in reality. And you have to know this is what I'm signing up for. I'm just taking on an additional responsibility of that same concept. I'll just tell you, for me, when I think about it with preachers and how I thought about it in the past, when there was hard situations or something like that, I'd be like, I shouldn't have to go through this. I shouldn't have to deal with this. I shouldn't have to go through whatever the case is. And yet the whole point is, as I've gone on to see, is no, that actually is your job. That is the role. And if you come with the wrong mindset into suffering, what suffering does, it reveals your heart. And it shows that you weren't really doing it maybe the way that you should, or for the right reasons like you should. And you're not doing it with joy and hope because you're wanting to hold on to what you have. And when you look sometimes at preachers or any kind of leadership, when they get tired and they get worn out, it's easy for that kind of mentality to be there. And trust me, I understand it. I really do. But the whole concept is, like he says in verse 16, therefore we do not lose heart. There's something ahead. The sacrifice is worth it, is the concept. How else do you think we can use this? Go ahead.
Well, first of all, we're not alone in the journey, and Jesus has already made that path of that suffering.
Yeah.
And so we can count on Him to be with us through those things, as He said about having our faith in Him. And also, one of the things that I think is important to know is that something that was brought to my attention was when Stephen passed away or died, that Jesus stood up.
Yeah.
And, we always hear about Christ sitting at the right hand of God and that kind of thing, but He was actually standing for that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way it is for us. We are trying to let Him guide our lives. And we go through some of the things that we go through.
Yeah, and it just reminds me of Psalm 116, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints. Jesus isn't saying, not that big of a deal. No, He's fully aware of exactly what's going on. And I think that's where we kind of lose it on both sides. On one side, we think, is what's ahead of me really worth it? Because if it was really worth it, if I said, hey, if you give me $1,000 and I'll give you $1 million, you'd be like, here's $1,000, okay? We would understand the exchange is not really the problem if we truly believe it, okay? So we have to think about the future concept. But I think part of this is when you're really suffering, and it's hard, and you're going through a lot of different things, you're wondering, does God really care? Is He really wanting this? am I going the right way? And what you were referring to, and what Psalm 116 is saying is, yes, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Not only the ultimate death, but like he says here, we are carrying in the body the death of Jesus. We're dying right now. Yes, we're alive in that sense, but we're enduring this for his sake. We're dying to ourselves. And I mean, this is not only a great concept for ministry, but this is also really, really big to kill the desire for sin in our lives. Because this same language is used in Colossians chapter 3, that when you have anger and disputes and sexual immorality and lying and all of that kind of stuff, what does he say to do? Kill yourself. Die to it. And almost always the reason we pursue those things is because we wonder, is it going to be okay? Is God going to take care of me? Is it worth it on the other side to, work through all of those kind of things? So we got just a couple of minutes here left. What else? I'm sure there's things that are coming to your mind as a result of this.
Shane, this kind of reminds me of this whole section here, James 1, and how you view trials. The things he mentions here in the closeout of this chapter, I think if we experience them, I think everybody, I know myself, I could hear myself going, I am just discouraged. I am absolutely discouraged. I am hard pressed and I'm discouraged. Like if you could almost take all the yet not crushed, yet not, and I could hear myself saying, I'm discouraged. But what he goes on to kind of talk about the motivation, I think, that helps him, right? And so the way he views it is, like in verse 10, it says that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. So he views these things as an opportunity to let the life of Jesus shine through in his work. And he goes on, there's other things like that too, showing the life of Jesus, talking about it helps him to see and have faith in that will be raised, So he doesn't look at these trials as discouragement. He looks at them in the positive, that it gives him an opportunity to do these things for Jesus, to strengthen his faith towards him. And I see a parallel there in James 1, how trials are supposed to strengthen our faith. So I think it's a good example of how we should look at trials in our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul uses it in Romans 5 to say the exact same thing. That's the testing of your faith leads to all of these things. It's what changes you. And I just want you to see this concept of the triumphal procession, that when we can get that identity, that image put into our mind, that's what Paul's talking about. Just a couple of parallels on this. But 1 Corinthians 4, we talked about this when we went through this, but he says in verse 9, "For I think God has exhibited to us as apostles last of all as men condemned to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men." And then you have it also in chapter 2, the same concept. We're like those that are being led in that procession. As according to the world's standards, it's looking like we're dying. Why are you enduring that? Why are you putting up with that? And there's a lot of times where maybe it's a child that you're having to, in essence, just keep dealing with and constantly suffering for. Maybe it's a marriage. Maybe it's a work relationship. Maybe it's a church relationship. People would look at it and say, you're a fool. Why are you living like that? And yet the whole thing is, it's because I love them. It's because that's what Jesus did with me. And when we live that, that's the aroma. You see the aroma? The aroma goes out. To some people, they see that's life. And that's the way that I need to live. But other people, they just look at that and they're put off by it. And it's and how we react to that message is just of utmost importance. Okay, well, we'll stop right there. Thanks for all the comments. I was telling Alina, I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. I know we're not making much progress, but there's so many applications. So thank you all.